All right, hello guys. We're back again with more Mr. Popper's Penguins. Hope that you are enjoying it. We are going to read chapters 13 and 14 today. Let's just kind of do a quick review over 11 and 12. 11 was called Greta. That is where we got to meet Greta and kind of see how how Captain Cook and Greta did together, how they were. Remember, we got them together because they were both acting very sick. They wouldn't eat. They were both very lonely. And then when Dr. Smith sent Greta to the Poppers, they helped each other out. And they ended up being just fine. First line of that chapter says, "So Captain Cook did not die after all." So that is good. And the Poppers created this incredible little snow fort playground for Greta and Captain Cook to play in. So that was fantastic. And the kids enjoyed it as well. However, it did make a very big mess in the Popper's house that Mrs. Popper was not a huge fan of. And they were very worried about being able to tell them apart. So Mr. Popper used his paint to paint their names on the back, which, very clever idea since he's got plenty of paint. So chapter 12 was called More Mouths to Feed. So Greta they moved the penguins from upstairs down into like the basement cellar area. And it wasn't very long after that when Greta laid her first egg, and then she laid another and another, which was very unusual because usually the penguins only lay two at a time. And so they were very concerned about having all of these penguins running around. And they loved to climb the cellar stairs that went back up in towards the main part of the house. And they would get up there and they would hit the door, so it had to stay closed. And then they would just like toboggan down on their bellies and go down the stairs again because, that's what penguins like to do. So they had a lot of fun doing that. All right, let's start with chapter 13. This one is called Money Worries. I wonder what that's going to be about. Money worries. Seems they have a lot of penguins as pets, and they didn't have a whole lot of money to start with, so let's see what this is going to be about. There came a night, however, when Mrs. Popper, having put the children to bed, stopped Mr. Popper on his way to the cellar. "Papa," she said, "I must talk to you. Come and sit down." "Yes, my love," said Mr. Popper. "What is on your mind?" "Papa," said Mrs. Popper, "I'm glad to see you having such a nice vacation, and I must say it's been easier than usual to keep the place tidy with you down in the basement all the time. But, Papa, what are we to do for money?" "What is the trouble?" asked Mr. Popper. "Well, of course, the penguins have to eat, but have you any idea what the bills for all those live fish are? I'm sure I don't know how we're ever going to pay for them. And the engineer who put the basement freezing plant keeps ringing the doorbell and asking for his money." "Is our money all gone?" asked Mr. Popper quietly. "Practically all. Of course, when it is all gone, maybe we could eat the 12 penguins for a while." "Oh, no, Mama," said Mr. Popper, "you don't mean that." "Well, I don't suppose I really could enjoy eating them, especially Greta and Isabella," said Mrs. Popper. "It would break our children's hearts too," said Mr. Popper. He sat there thoughtfully for a while. "I have an idea, Mama," he said at last. "Maybe we could sell them to somebody, and then we would have a little money to live on," said Mrs. Popper. "No," said Mr. Popper. "I have a better idea. We will keep the penguins. Mama, you have heard of the trained seals acting in theaters, right?" "Well, of course I've heard of trained seals," answered Mrs. Popper. "I even saw one once. They balance balls on the ends of their nose." "Very well then," said Mr. Popper. "If there can be trained dogs and trained seals, why can't there be trained penguins?" "Perhaps you're right, Papa. Of course I am right. And you can help me train the penguins." The next day they had the piano moved down into the basement at the end of the rink. Mrs. Popper had not played the piano since she had married Mr. Popper, but with a little practice, she soon began to remember some of the pieces that she had forgotten. "What these penguins like to do most," said Mr. Popper, "is to drill like an army sergeant, to watch Nelson and Columbus climb up and down the steps and then toboggan down. And so we will build our own act around those tricks." don't need costumes anyway, said Mrs. Popper, looking at the droll little figures. They already have a costume. So Mrs. Popper picked out 3 different tunes to play on the basement piano, one for each different kind of act. Soon the penguins knew from hearing the music just what they were to do. When they were supposed to parade like a lot of soldiers, Mrs. Popper played Schubert's Military March. When Nelson and Columbus were to fight each other with their flippers, Mrs. Popper played the Merry Widow Waltz. And when the penguins were supposed to climb in toboggan, Janie and Bill would drag out into the middle of the ice 2 portable slap ladders and a board that Mr. Popper had used when he was decorating homes. Then Mrs. Popper would play a pretty descriptive piece called By the Brook. It was cold in the cellar, of course, so that Mrs. Popper had to learn to play the piano with her gloves on. By the end of January, Mr. Popper was sure the penguins were ready to appear in any theater in the country. Okay, so they have a little act going on here. All right, chapter 14, Mr. Greenbaum. Look here, said Mr. Popper at breakfast one morning. It says here in the Morning Chronicle that Mr. Greenbaum, the owner of the Palace Theater, is in town. He's got a string of theaters all over the country, so I guess we had better go down and see him. That evening, it was Saturday, the 29th of January, the Popper family and their 12 trained penguins, 2 of them carrying flags on their beaks, left the house to find the Palace Theater. The penguins were now so well trained that Mr. Popper decided that it was not necessary to keep them on leashes. Indeed, they walked to the bus line very nicely in the following line of march. Mr. Popper, then Captain Cook, Columbus, Victoria, Mrs. Popper, then Nelson and Jenny, Magellan and Adelina, Bill Popper and Janie Popper, then Scott and Isabella, and lastly, Ferdinand and Louisa. So this was how they walked in the line. The bus stopped at the corner, and before the astonished driver could protest, they all had climbed on, and the bus was on its way. Do I pay half fare for the birds, or do they get to go for free? Asked Mr. Popper. Janie goes, half fare, but I'm 10, said Bill. Hush, said Mrs. Popper as the children and she and Mr. Popper found their seats. The penguins followed in an orderly fashion. Say, mister, said the driver, where do you think you're going to go with that exhibit? Downtown, said Mr. Popper. Here, let's call it 50 cents. And let's just have it go at that. To tell you the truth, I'll ask Cow when they went past me, said the driver. It's a trained penguin act, explained Mr. Popper. Are they really birds? Asked the driver. Oh, yes, said Mr. Popper. I'm just taking them down to the palace to interview Mr. Greenbaum, the big theater owner. Well, if I hear any complaints, off they go at the next corner, said the driver. Fair enough, said Mr. Popper, who wanted to ask for transfers in that case, but decided to let well enough alone. Sorry, lost my place here. Okay, the penguins were behaving very well. They were sitting quietly, 2 in a seat, while the other passengers looked on. Sorry, said Mr. Popper, addressing everyone on the bus, but I'll have to open all the windows. These are Antarctic penguins, and they are used to having a lot colder air than this. It took Mr. Popper quite a while to open all of the windows, which were stuck fast. When he had succeeded, there were plenty of remarks from the other passengers. Many of them began to complain to the driver, who told Mr. Popper to take his birds off the bus. He had to repeat this several times. Finally, he refused to take the bus any further until Mr. Popper got off. By this time, however, the bus had gone so far downtown that none of them minded having to get out onto the street and walking. Only a block ahead of them shone the lights of the Palace Theater. Hello, said the theater manager as the Poppers and the penguins trooped past him. Sure, Mr. Greenbaum's here in my office. You know, I've heard about these birds of yours, but I didn't really believe it. Mr. Greenbaum, meet the Popper penguins. I'll be leaving you. I have to go backstage. The penguins, now standing politely in 2 rows of 6 each, looked curiously at Mr. Greenbaum. Their 24 white circled eyes were very solemn. All you people crowding around the door, go back where you belong, said Mr. Greenbaum. This is a private conference. Then he got up and shut the door. The Popper sat down while Mr. Greenbaum walked up and down up and down the double row of penguins, looking them over. "It looks like an act," he said. "Oh, it's an act all right," said Mr. Popper. "It's Popper's Performing Penguins. First time on any stage, direct from the South Pole." He and Mrs. Popper had thought up that name for the act. "Couldn't we call them Popper's Pink-Toed Penguins?" asked Mr. Greenbaum. Mr. Popper thought for a moment. "No," he said. "I'm afraid we couldn't. That sounds too much like chorus girls or ballet dancers, and these birds are pretty serious. I really don't think they would like that." "All right," said Mr. Greenbaum. "Show me your act." "There's music to it," said Janie. "Mama plays the piano." "Is that true, madam?" asked Mr. Greenbaum. "Yes, sir," answered Mrs. Popper. "Well, there's a piano behind you," said Mr. Greenbaum. "You may begin, madam. I want to see this act. If it's any good, you people have come to the right place. I've got theaters from coast to coast, but first let's see your penguins perform. Ready, madam?" "We'd better move the furniture first," said Bill. All right, so let's see how they perform, and we will find out tomorrow.